Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well and welcome back to another session. And it has been so wonderful having you all here. And I would like to congratulate all of you that you have made to the program. Today, I'll be your moderator and with Augustine Okana. And Fred, next one. Oh, sorry. I think the Yes. Today moderators is Augustine Okana, who is a founder and chairperson of the Global Youth Coalition. And I am Frederick Binamungu, a Global Youth Coalition African Strategic Engagement and Advocacy Manager. And I hope this training you'll be getting to have well understand of different perspective and idea on different matters. Next, Fred. So the key learning outcome today is understanding Indigenous lesson on the climate change, on the climate action, but also understanding the need and gathering on the nature-based solution. And the third, understanding what needs from the COP30, what is needed from the COP30s. Next. So the trade agenda is timing in UHC 100 up to 105. It's welcome, and I think Abdul come in after Abdul on 20 minutes. Shailan Barefoot will come in after 20 minutes. Moses Kogas Flawless will come in, and after we'll be having a Q&A sessions. So our amazing speaker today for the indigenous people and local communities and nature will be having Abdul Wahid Kam, the PhD candidate, University of Oxford, but also we have Shailahi Barefoot, Wisdom Keeper, Indigenous Constituency, and also Mos Kagos, Flawless, Human Rights Officer for Indigenous people and minority officers for the High Commissioner for the Human Rights. So, Augustine, come on.
Thank you so much, Frederick, and really happy to see you everyone here. And I'm sending a huge hug to Alexis McGiver, who was supposed to be today the moderator of this session, but she doesn't feel really good. So we send you a lot of energies, Alexis, and hope you to see you soon here in the Global Youth Climate Training. So now, guys, we're gonna welcome Abdul Wahid Khan. He is a PhD researcher in geography and environment, researching the management on commons in Chitral, Pakistan, and the impact of nationalization on local communities. He discusses local wisdom and the spiritual and environmental significance on the common and has contributed to discussions on climate change, focus on its effects on mountain communities. He focuses on indigenous rights, pastoral and mountain peoples, collective environmental management, and intergenerational governance processes. So, such an honor for me, Abdul, to have you here today, and looking forward to learn from you. And thank you so much for giving some of your time.
Of course. Thank you so much, Alexis, who is not here today, unfortunately, for inviting me to speak to, these wonderful youth from around the world. I have been a part of this before. I have worked with Alexis to make the booklet from last year. So I am quite passionate about this group, and I have always enjoyed listening to the recordings of this. Um, So thank you so much, Augustine. Thank you so much, Fred, and everyone else who is involved in organizing this. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor for me to speak today on this very interesting and important topic of land rights for indigenous communities. So basically, I would be drawing from my research in Chitral, Pakistan. And I mean, the main aim of why I'm here today is to do two things basically. So first is to talk about land rights for indigenous communities. But secondly, I know many participants here today would be interested in joining academia, and they would be wondering, how we are going to make a change using our research. So I'll try to connect the two using my own research as an example for all of you. So basically, my research talks about commons. Which is called Mujayo in the local Khowar language in Chitral, Pakistan. It's a pastoralist mountain community. So I am, in a way, advocating for land rights for the people, but also the more than human of that region. So by more than human, we mean anything, that's not human. Basically, it previously it was called non-human and so on, but the idea of more than human in geography is to give them more agency. For example, a tree is a tree not because human sees it as a tree, but it is a tree because of its own agency. It exists, it has its own importance. So that's what we are going to talk about. It's going to be obviously a bit of an academic discussion. So I hope that you enjoy this discussion, but also I'll try to break down all the concepts for you. So this is a bit of an outline of my presentation today. So we will talk about, what the objective of my research was, some of the government perspectives. So because there's a nationalization going on, and then I'll try to tell you how I have distributed my research and divided into three parts, and some sort of findings from the field, and then I'll talk about some methodology and a way forward, and we'll end with some of the lessons of how can young academics like yourselves help land right issues for indigenous communities. So a little bit of a background, like I said, that and also I understand there has been some issues with interpretation. So I apologize as well if people are not able to understand for any reason. But I come from Chitral myself, and when I was doing my master's research there, I talked to different people and I asked them, okay, so like what are the major issues we are facing? Or, just like in daily conversation, people would tell me, okay, one of the big issue that we are facing is that the government is sort of taking over our land. So the pastoralist common land that people use for grazing and, for other pastoralist purposes, and which made me obviously start my PhD around 4 years ago. So I'm in the final year of my PhD, hopefully submitting this year. And Chitral, as you can see from this map here, it's very north of Pakistan, very close to Afghanistan, but also Central Asia, and close to China. So it has a very interesting geographical location as well. Uh, so it basically started with this 1975 notification that the government passed, which sort of, because Chitral was a princely state before, when it joined Pakistan, like any nation state, the country was like, okay, we should nationalize all the land that does not belong to private people. So that's how, all the communal land that was, um, okay, I'm getting some messages that people cannot hear me.
Yeah.
Can you, okay?
Can we just confirm, guys, that you have audio? And sorry again, we were having some trouble with the interpretation today, especially in the Portuguese and Arabic channel. But okay, you can hear. Can you guys confirm in the language that you are hearing it? If it's in English, Spanish, just to see that English is okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. And again, sorry everyone for this inconvenience. And sorry, Abdul.
It's
Uh,
okay. It's technology. It's not always in our side. So
Sometimes it happens.
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So this is sort of the background of why I started this study, because if the common land is taken away from the indigenous pastoralist community, then obviously their livelihood is getting impacted. They wouldn't be able to raise cattle and wouldn't be able to continue their livelihood. So that's how I got interested in it. I got interested in researching this and started my PhD on this. So within academia, obviously you should have a broader scholarly perspective, as along with, if you have any other motives like advocacy and so on. So obviously the scholarly understanding of the ontology, which is basically what is commons, and the epistemology, how do people know what commons are. So there was one major idea for me, especially to look at it from a decolonial praxis. A lot of common studies is highly colonized and looked at from a Western perspective, and that's what I wanted to challenge as well throughout my study, and to create alternative pastoralist, indigenous culture and more than human discourse around commons. And finally, sort of theorizing human nature relationship that has often been presented as two separate things in the West, while we'll also probably hear from other indigenous scholars that human nature God sort of relationship is always embedded in many indigenous cultures, and it's the same in Chitral. So again, why does it matter? The reason it matters is because now there are government officials trying to displace people from their land. They are being used for neoliberal purposes like tourism. And an interesting sort of dynamics of this is like a lot of the land is also used for climate change projects. So, all of the sort of green dump is happening in many of the rural areas where the government is trying to implement, like, let's say, the 10 billion tree tsunami. It's a funny name. People from Pakistan would know. So they are trying to plant a lot of trees, but they would usually choose like a pastoralist land. So it's a bit of a situation where people are struggling with tourism, with climate projects, and being displaced from their homes and from their livelihoods, which is why this research is important for me and for other people. So I have basically uh, presented the findings in four different chapters, and this would just help you to see, like, how do we deal in academia with such complex topics, and how do we sort of share our findings. So the first one is the nationalization of the commons and the apoliticization of Chitral. So this would also extend to most indigenous communities, how within the modern nation state systems, indigenous communities are apoliticized. They are sort of removed from the politics of the nation, in a way, like, they are given different ways, in which you will see that these people are apoliticized, but mostly in the case of Chitral, the people are termed as being Chitralis as peaceful and educated people, and they don't revolt against anyone and things like that. So these discourses have caused in exclusion from the politics, but also because it's a rural area, a lot of the political system is based in urban areas, and it's very hard for people to get to these avenues and share their views about what is happening in Chitral, which is one major sort of finding of why this is happening. The second one I talked about is land ontologies and place attachment and commons in Chitral. Again, this is something that many indigenous communities also sort of can relate to. How do we see land? How do we see commons? In a lot of places, especially in the West, land is usually seen as a resource, as a material only, while in many indigenous communities, land is not just a material object, it's also a very spiritual sort of, it has a very spiritual ontology. It is in Chitral, it's considered to be, especially some of the mountains and the commons are considered to be homes for fairies and spiritual beings. There is a shared heritage, a collective sort of responsibility, and people come together to manage the commons, to use it for their pastoralist livelihood. So it creates a community out of it. And there is obviously emotional ontology. People have this emotional attachment to these land and commons that I have tried to highlight. A lot of this is missing from most of the policy debates in the West, and in many nation state countries as well, which sort of marginalize indigenous perspectives from these discussions. And this is why I have tried to to highlight those. And then I deal with the idea of cultural escape, a concept in which, culture is seen as a wider integrated identity. So it's not just like, how we see culture as what people do, but also in a wider sense, how land becomes a part of the culture and culture becomes a part of the land. So they are like quite intrinsically, attached. And I have tried to sort of bring that perspective in this research as well. Another thing, like I was telling you, is more than human relations in Chitrali Commons. So a lot of time, when we talk about land, when we talk about commons, we usually think of it as a human resource only. But in many indigenous communities, land is not just for humans, it's also for non-humans, for more than humans. Like I said, in Chitral, there's a very interesting dynamics of management of the mountains by fairies, like I said. So a lot of people think that, some of the mountains are actually owned by fairies, and we have like wildlife there, like the ibex, they're considered to be the daughters of fairies. So in this way, it's creating this harmony with nature, which obviously, if you think from a rationalistic perspective, might not make sense. But for these people, it has created this coexistence and peaceful, sort of survival for such a long time. So I have tried to bring that perspective, in the front of this discussion, and to see, like, how we can decenter human and look at all other things that depend on land, and how can we include that in the policy. So one of my paper basically deals with more than human rights to the land. um, so one thing that I have done is used poetry as a research method, and a lot of you would be wondering, why is that? Because poetry is an interesting indigenous way of knowing. It's how people communicate. It's how they share their feelings. And I got several poetries talking about how they feel about the nationalization, how their connection with land is, and how they include more than human in their poetry. And this is extremely important if you're doing research. Try to understand what knowledge system the local people use, and that can only create the best kind of data that you want, instead of imposing something from outside. I am really sort of like, conscious of the time, so I'm going to speed through some of them, but obviously we can have a discussion later on as well. So basically, the indigenous claim to land comes from that how people have used and cared for the land for thousands of years. The word for indigenous or aboriginal in the local language is boomki, which means from the land. So the people are considered, because there is no known history of these people coming from elsewhere. So the people say that they have emerged out of the land, so they're like so old and so aboriginal to the land, that they belong there and they should own it. There are oral histories, there are clan-based customary laws, and a respectful sort of relationship with the land, and it's obviously a source of dependence for livelihood. And one interesting thing a person said was, I'm older than Pakistan. So who I interviewed in Pakistan, as you know, came into being in 1947. There are people who were born before that, and they are saying, imagine our ancestors have lived in this place for so long, and how is it that a country so young is going to now take over our land and displace us? So these are some excerpts from the field where people were saying, I think for example, the nature that the government is now claiming to conserve, because a lot of displacement of indigenous communities happens in the name of conservation. And this person is saying, how can the government conserve something that we have actually done for so long? It would not have been here without us. And also this sort of navigating between what the government is providing to the indigenous communities and what they're taking away in return. So looking at some of the exploitation that's happening there as well. So a way forward is, there are civil society associations, there are court cases, and there are wider academic discussions that are happening in Chitral and in other communities around the world to sort of highlight what's happening with indigenous land. Um, I'm going to just end with this advice for some young scholars, and some of you who might want to go into academia and might be thinking, a lot of time there is a mismatch in a way, or disconnect between academia and the real life. But if you want to, you can connect those bridges. And you have to approach indigenous land rights with humility and respect to start with. And especially if you are not an indigenous person yourself, try to listen first before you come to conclusions. If you're a policymaker, try to listen, try to hear those stories that have existed for thousands of years, and try to use decolonial, participatory, localized methods, like I said, poetry, oral history, and so on, and create that academic rigor within that. Collaborate with local communities, co-researchers. A lot of time indigenous communities are really sort of hesitant to engage in research because they have been exploited for so long through data extraction and so on. So try to include them as co-researchers rather than as subject of your research. um, Obviously advocate for policy grounded in indigenous knowledge and cosmology. Use, and again, I think this is the most important thing, academics have a lot of power. So when you talk to people, they take you seriously, and I have seen it myself. When you tell them that you have done a PhD, done research for 4 years, published in peer-reviewed articles and so on, people are like, okay, that has a weight to it. So when you use that weight for the benefit of indigenous communities, that's going to bring a lot of good for everyone. And then, also do not shy away from presenting indigenous land rights and indigenous knowledge as a legitimate demand within the nation state. So a lot of time you are made to think as if they are not legitimate, they do not align with the modern nation state, but you should definitely push for those things, and you should definitely say that it's a very legitimate demand that we are making. In the process, try to preserve indigenous knowledge, custom rituals, because a lot of epistemicide is happening. The knowledge system is going away. But if you do research with indigenous communities, try to preserve that knowledge if you can. And finally, go back to the community and build up a lifelong relationship instead of going there once, taking data and disappearing. So, try to keep that respectful relationship with these people. Help them if you can, the way they have helped you, research your subject. So, I think I'm going to close my sort of short discussion there, and I'll wait for some questions at the end. And I'm really looking forward to some more discussion if we have the time. But I also consider that some really exciting speakers are going to speak after me. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abdul, for that really deep conversation that you're having with us, and it's really important and supportive. Actually, just some days ago, we were having a conversation with Lujane, the BC of GYC, if we can start a poetry program in GYC towards the different wars and genocides that are happening in places like Palestine. And it's for me, it's really great to hear it also from you, like if someone is in doing research around these topics and they are also suggesting going towards how we feel and how we express about this, and this is also supportive to the different individuals that are unfortunately around these sad events. So thank you so much, Abdul, for this, and looking forward to hear more for you. We have some questions that we will do at the end of the session. And now back to Frederick.
Yes, maybe to remind you all, we'll be having a Q&A session, so don't forget to drop your your question to the question box, and we'll be elevating back to them after the session. And once again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and perspective, Abdul, with us today, and for such insight and reminding us the local knowledge and indigenous people, the way they are important, and the inclusive part of involving them on the different perspective and different agenda, the rich knowledge that they have. It's one of the most insightful thing that I have lived with. So going back, we are going to our second speaker today, Sheilahi Blackfoot. If I'm mistaken
Oh,
your names, I'm sorry, but
no worries. Sheila Barefoot.
Okay, so she is an environmental justice advocate and cultural coordinator for Sustain Us COP30 delegation after graduating with the BS in genetics and plant biology from UC Berkeley. She then worked at the Native America sorry a bit. Yes, and then she worked on the Native America Health Center in San Francisco and Green Care Assistance before pursuing an MHS in environmental health at Johns Hopkins, where she continued focused on Indigenous health disparities. She had the privilege of working with learning from dozens of Indigenous organizations, becoming a jack of all trades. Right now, her other parts include co-leading the planting committee for the Indigenous People Summit, serving as the Coming Cleaner pesticide mapping project team, and being a mentor for 2025 young climate leaders of colors called. So today, she will focus on intersection between environmental racism and the exploration and the violence against Indigenous people. This will include the focus on free, prior, and informed consent, and the tokenism in environment justice space, especially in regard to demand on artistic and creative labor. So welcome so much.
Thank you so much, Frederick. Apologies regarding my slides. I didn't get them until the very end, and I'm joining in on my phone. I don't know if it's
ولا أعرف إن كانت
It's
الشفافات
fine.
واضحة
It is very
بالنسبة
fine. You can
لكم.
be
هل
heard.
ترونها؟
sorry, I'm hearing multiple translations. Apologies. Anyhow, so I'm joining in on my phone. I don't know if it's possible for anybody else to
You can share them. Yes.
share the slides.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
that is possible. Fred, maybe you can help us to display it on the screen.
Yeah, one moment, I'll do that now.
Okay. Thank you
Okay.
so much. And while that's going on, I'll just clarify a few things and echo everyone's praise of Abdul's amazing presentation. That was so beautiful. And I really loved the incorporation of Indigenous spirituality and how important that is, because I feel that that is one of the things that when discussed outside of an Indigenous context and removed from the important cultural considerations and the value that that brings to shaping our relationship with the land, it is one of the things that frequently gets tokenized and completely delegitimized, when in reality, it's quite central to our entire ways of being. So my presentation will focus a bit on, as mentioned before, the intersections of environmental racism and violence against the land and the parallels that are there, and how a inaccurate understanding, nope, not mine, and how an inaccurate understanding of decolonization contributes to tokenization. So, for instance, you may have heard decolonization thrown around as something that can be done on an individual level. It is absolutely not something that can be done individually. It is a systemic thing, and we cannot simply just decolonize our minds or decolonize our practices. Decolonization is not decolonization without the rematriation of Indigenous land and life. That is one of the most important takeaways. We cannot simply decolonize just by thinking about things differently without serious material change. That material change includes land back. That material change includes changing our environments to make it so that way Indigenous life can be sustained. So that way free, prior, and informed consent with UNDRIP is upheld, because that's something that we need in order to maintain our various lifeways. So as many of you know, you have all probably heard of free, prior, and informed consent before. Essentially, it is a basic underpinning of Indigenous peoples' ability to conclude and implement valid treaties and agreements, to have sovereignty over and protect our lands and natural resources, and to develop and participate in processes that redress violations of our land and treaty rights. By free, we mean free from any external manipulation, interference, coercion, outside pressure, duress, fraud, bribery, and divide and conquer tactics. Prior refers to meaningful, fully informed consent sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization or decision-making of activities or developments. And thank you so much, those are the correct slides. Informed means full disclosures and having all the information available, reflecting all views and positions in appropriate languages and formats that recognize the unique and diverse Indigenous governing structures. So, for instance, in the US, and this is something that is unfortunately still done, there's many instances where someone will just go up to a random tribal member instead of a representative of tribal governments. There's actually kind of an issue contemporarily of whenever Indigenous peoples, whether or not we are actually representing our various tribal governments, we're kind of perceived as representatives, and that really does a huge disservice to the complexity of tribal governments. Like, no one goes up to a random person from a European nation who's at a international conference and assumes that they're a government representative. So there's just a lot of inherent racism in even still in the UN space that I've personally experienced, where the complexity of our tribal governments is kind of stripped away. And then on the next slide, the final tenet mentioned before is consent. Consent is the community or tribal governmental body making a clear and full agreement of the proposed activity or development. Consent must be acquired at the earliest stages. This is one of the parallels that I will be drawing on beforehand, because the consent that is frequently contested for Indigenous communities mirrors violations of consent to Indigenous peoples, and in particular, Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folks. So violence done towards the land is paralleled in violence done towards Indigenous peoples. That is on the next slide, and we'll go into some frameworks for this on the next slide. Thank you so much. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is just an excerpt from Amber Stark, who is a Afro-Indigenous scholar and has done a lot of really great work on the intersections between Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, and why that is so critical for all of us, and why this plays into issues that will be present at COP30, such as just transition, which I'll get into a little bit later, but just to read a bit of an excerpt. So, an authentic sovereign Indigenous future is rooted in the fundamental belief that Indigenous peoples globally have the inherent right to self-governance, self-determination, and political and social autonomy. A sovereign Indigenous future is also one where our epistemologies and understandings of the natural world are honored and respected as legitimate scientific knowledge. So I think I'm going to be echoing what a lot of other folks have stated previously, that our worldviews and our sciences need to be respected as legitimate knowledge. I mean, the delegitimization of Indigenous knowledge as something less than science, and the putting of science on a pedestal as the only way to be able to rationally interact with the world, is done specifically to delegitimize our knowledge systems and uphold white supremacy. Like, that is frankly all it is a tool of. We can go on to the next slide, which is just a bio about Amber Stark. Again, so she's an advocate, organizer, cultural critic, decolonial theorist, and critically, she is an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation and is also of Shawnee, Yuchi, Quapaw, and Cherokee descent. Okay, we can You can all read the rest of that on her own time. Apologies, I'm mindful of the time right now. This gets into what I was stating before, how decolonization needs to bring about a rematriation of Indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things that we want to do to improve our societies. So something can be a good thing to do and not necessarily be decolonial. Like, we are going to need to do a lot of things to improve the world that do not necessarily fit under a decolonization framework. Like, yes, when I say that we cannot simply think about things differently and consider that an act of decolonization, that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about things differently. We do all still need to change our mindsets to cast off colonial mentalities that continue to invade our consciousness and have us uphold settler society. So that still needs to be done, but that's not technically decolonization. Decolonization requires sacrifice and change. Decolonization requires dominant power structures to restore Indigenous land and life. We need to be treated as legitimate equals, and people need to start getting serious about this. This is why we're asking for land back. This is why we are asking for free, prior, and informed consent before more destruction of our land is done with extractive industries. I'll be going over a couple during this time period. So the extractive industries that I'll be focusing on are mining and the petrochemical industry, and I'll give a little example of that with agriculture. We can actually skip this slide for the time being. Yes, parallel violence. So the colonizer dehumanization of Black and Indigenous peoples is reflected in their treatment of Earth and all her children. Treating Earth and non-human, or rather more than human, plant and animal relatives as commodities and resources to be exploited is a settler colonial mentality sustained by treating Black and Indigenous peoples as disposable property. So the treating of other living beings as property makes way for treating other human beings as property, as long as we are considered and classified as inferior humans, then we're going to be treated as such. But part of what makes way for that to even be possible is this idea that our more than human relatives are undeserving of the same type of respect that we give one another, and the idea that they can be exploited for profit at will without any regard to their own autonomy. And in many ways, it mirrors the kind of colonial conception of nature and femininity, something to be exploited, something at your service, something that does not have autonomy or will outside of serving a patriarchal institution. So that's a parallel that I could write a dissertation on that. But I'll give you just like a tiny little snippet throughout this. So yes, perfect example here. So missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirits, also called missing and murdered Indigenous relatives to be more inclusive of all of our relatives of all genders who are facing violence. So one example of this that's really prevalent is man camps. So ecological destruction and pipeline construction cause spikes in sexual violence. These are frequently due to man camps, which are basically like camps of construction and other workers that are brought in to rural areas for pipeline construction. They're emboldened to act with impunity because they have no ties to any community members. And due to the unique jurisdiction of tribal communities, because we are sovereign nations, so we have tribal court, but then we are also under federal jurisdiction, and then we're under state jurisdiction and under city jurisdiction. So all of these competing jurisdictions muddle any kind of legal proceedings to try and hold perpetrators accountable. But it has been proven that where these camps come, violence follows. There is a 70% jump in aggravated assault and a nearly 45% increase in unlawful sexual contact. And then, of course, the murder rate for Native women is 10 times that of the average American. So that's just a reality that we live with. Yes. And that's something that is perpetuated and enabled by racial capitalism. So capitalism emerged within the feudal order and flowered in the cultural soil of a Western civilization already thoroughly infused with racialization. With with racializism. Racism. My bad. It's like 6 a.m. over here in my time zone. So apologies for being a little bit out of it. In any case, these racial dynamics and capitalism feed on each other. And it is no surprise that our lives and our bodies are considered less than in the pursuit of profit. All of these industries are for a pursuit of profit. That gets really apparent when we get into some of the critical mineral examples on the next slide. So key chemicals and helpful frameworks. So there's a definition of environmental racism on here to describe the disproportionate burden of industrialization and environmental contaminants that Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and other non-white populations bear in the U.S. Again, I am approaching this from a framework of the so-called U.S. or Turtle Island, as Indigenous people call it. And then other chemicals that are part of this. So my master's capstone was on Indigenous exposure to a class of endocrine disrupting chemicals called obesogens, which, as the name implies, cause rates of metabolic disease and diabetes and obesity. Some of these are described here. And part of why they're important is because these chemicals are released during various industrial and extractive processes and as part of the agriculture industrial complex. And these cause disproportionate changes to communities that are already laboring under medical racism and a lack of access to adequate health care. And on top of that, a heightened disease burden on all fronts. So we are more likely to be exposed to various chemicals due to extractive processes, which harms our life and livelihood and causes reproductive harm down the line and causes a disproportionate disease burden on women, while we already have the chips stacked against us to be able to do anything about it. Okay, on the next slide. Okay. One microcosm of this that I love bringing attention to, because we don't necessarily think about the connection between the agricultural industrial complex and the petrochemical industry and pipelines. So synthetic chemicals are produced from petroleum hydrocarbon feedstocks. And basically all that means is oil equals plastic and chemicals. Oil equals pesticides. The agricultural industry is at this point one of the major upholders of the fossil fuel industry. Over 1 billion pounds of pesticide is used in the US alone, and that releases the equivalent of 600 million metric tons of CO2. And then that's just another example of colonial food systems. Yes, we can reclaim our foodways. Those are just a couple examples of people that I'm privileged enough to work with. That's Yvette Scott. She works in the Black community in Cleveland. That's Chef Nico Albert Williams, who is Cherokee, and she runs Burning Cedar Sovereign Kitchen. Yeah, apologies. I know I'm running over time. You can continue on to the next slide. Okay, so critical minerals, and we'll probably keep it here. But as you can see, the mining industry, which is something that is trying to be touted as a transition away from fossil fuels, is actually not any better. So up to 97% of critical minerals are located within 35 miles of Native American reservations. They're not critical. They're profitable. Up to $30 billion profitable. And in order to get these minerals, including copper, that requires the violation of our sacred sites, including sacred sites for my people on Oak Flat. And this is just, in my opinion, another slow form of genocide. They want to blast in a 2-mile wide crater in order to extract copper, 9% of which globally is used for the military industrial complex. They just want to commit genocide, a slow form of ecological genocide, a slow form of poisoning against our people to get the materials to commit genocide against indigenous peoples on another continent. So this is just a dual form of violence and paralleled violence in a very, very direct fashion. They are violating the earth to then violate us. And we are bearing the brunt on multiple levels. Okay, so that can be continued. All right, I'm probably gonna skip that. Also gonna skip that because I know I'm basically at time. Apologies for that. So yes, we're gonna end with this quote. So another Amber Starks quote. I fundamentally believe our arrival at Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty will certainly require us to remember who we are outside of oppressors' institutions, ideologies, and imaginations. It is a future that will ask us to internalize and embody the notion that subjugation is neither our birthright nor our inheritance. So in order to fully reach this decolonized state, and in order for us to break off colonial shackles, we need to remember who we are absent the colonizer and absent all of their systems. We need to imagine a post-extractive world. And we need to stop using this artificial demand as a justification to continue extracting. There is nothing more important than continuing the future of our Earth and continuing humanity. I don't care what so-called degraded quality of life that is going to require. Because currently, the colonial quality of life in so-called developed and rather overdeveloped nations is just causing us to be sick. You saw that whole list of chemicals that we are constantly being exposed to that is doing nothing but causing us more harm than good. So whatever form of life that we are facing now is doing nothing but starving our souls in the name of false progress. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions at the end of this because I sped through half of this.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for such a powerful presentation, and this is very useful. I think a lot of the participants who have time to pass through the notes and deep dive what you have prepared for them, and they will use these notes to equip themselves with the knowledge that you have prepared. So thank you so much. By reminding you, we want to be part of your learning process. So we'll be requesting for you to share the highlight of the session on your social networks and and tag us in Instagram at the Global Youth .co, but also Twitter, the Global Youth Coalition, LinkedIn, the Global Youth Coalition, Oxford Net Zero, Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, but also in YouTube where you get all the session uploaded, Oxford Smith School, but also without forgetting the hashtag of GYCT 2025. Augustine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Frederick. An amazing presentation, Sheila. It's really important, and I just want to highlight what you just shared with us, how important is the free, prior, and informed consultation of the indigenous people and the local communities, and it's something that right now is happening in different territories that is not being respected. And in case of Ecuador, where I am from, there's a huge debate right now for a new law that is gonna pass through, and is again not the indigenous and local communities are not being consulted. And just using this platform to kindly share this message to the people out there that it's important to raise our voice and it's important to present solutions toward these problems. And now we come back to our third speaker. I'm happy to introduce Morse Coagas Flores. Morse is the human rights officers for indigenous peoples and minorities at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. As a human rights defender, he strongly believes in the philosophy leave no one behind. Morse is involved in empowering indigenous people by enhancing their understanding of international human rights mechanism, and it's also a strong advocate of LGBTQ+ rights. In pursuing these goals, he contributes to public engagement and education by providing interviews, lectures, including discussions with the UN Voluntary Fund. Really happy to see you again, Morse. We had the pleasure to meet each other in one of the COPs. I think it was COP 28. And happy to see you here in the Global Youth Climate Training Program. Now the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Agustín. Thank you so much. Buenos días a todos. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Mapiang agaw ni kamong amin. I'm giving you greetings in my own indigenous languages. I'm an Ibanag. I come from the northern tip of the Philippines. I means people. Banag is the river in my language. So I am a part of that community who belongs to the largest river in the Philippines. I'd like to thank my colleague Abdul and Sheila for opening this very important topic on indigenous peoples. From my own contribution or inputs, I have actually prepared two parts. I wanted to, when I was asked to give this training to this cohort, I was asked to give an overview of the UN human rights mechanism that deals specifically with indigenous peoples, and especially those that provides opportunities for indigenous young people young people in general. And these mechanisms are mainly based in Geneva, where the UN human rights architecture are basically attached. On the other hand, knowing the background of young people who are in this session, I also prepared a bit of, I would say, a summary of indigenous people's participation in climate change negotiation, where from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I'm a part of our negotiating team. So before I really start my presentation, I would do a bit of a survey because, I always try to build what you already know on the subject before I will jump into what I have prepared for you. So I will ask a couple of questions, and you are most welcome to use the chat box. So the first question I would like to ask you is, can you please tell me where you're from, your countries? Okay.
Wow, so cool. I should do a video of this.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. It looks like we have our all the countries or regions of the world represented by a number from Latin America, Africa, and I see a lot of people from Asia as well. From Europe, that's very good. North America, well done. Second question, is there anybody in this group who self-identify or who belongs to an indigenous community? If yes, can you please put your community in the chat, please? We have Oraon, Mitun. I know Mitun. We have Kakiteyo from, I guess this is from the Caribbean. We have Apache, Akamba, Kenya. Can you be more specific? Our colleague from Kenya. I know you have a lot of communities in Kenya. We have Kichwa, Newar from Nepal, indeed, yes. Derashe from Ethiopia, Maasai. All right. Wonderful. Now, those of you who are non-indigenous but still is in the session, what's the interest for you? Why are you interested in indigenous issues or indigenous peoples in general? Go ahead. Okay, somebody from Sicily saying this is an islander, not indigenous in itself. Okay. Historical injustices. All right, very good. Yes. Muhammad is coming from Indonesia, saying that it's a home of many indigenous peoples. Indeed, Indonesia is the home of the second biggest indigenous communities in the world, after China, by the way. India has an indigenous population as well, yeah. Okay, to work, incredibly unfair, yes. Centuries of knowledge, climate justice. Very good. Excellent. Now, knowing your background more or less now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, especially for those of you who are coming on this subject of indigenous peoples for the first time. Now, I'm not going to ask you a question now, but I'm going to give you some facts and figures that we know. The first thing that we need to do when we talk about indigenous peoples is to ask, who are they? How many indigenous people are we talking about? Okay, so according to reports and research, when we talk about indigenous peoples, we are looking at 470 million indigenous people around the world who are living in more or less 90 countries. Now, you need to be very careful here, because when we talk about indigenous peoples, in many parts of the world, in fact, in Africa and Asia, it's a very challenging question. In certain parts of the world, when we talk about indigenous peoples, especially in Latin America, indigenous peoples are already recognized in their laws. There are policies that recognize indigenous people. One thing that you need to understand is there is no international definition of indigenous people. The United Nations tried to do that for over 30 years. It didn't work. Why? Because you cannot define people who's been existing even before the formation of the modern state. Okay? What we have in international law are criteria. Okay? And we talk about criteria, there are two types. Some are objective criteria that you can see, you can quantify, and some are subjective criteria. Now, the most fundamental criteria when we talk about indigenous people, when we identify indigenous people, is the principle of self-identification. Okay? What does it mean, self-identification? Meaning that when someone identifies as such, I am an Ibanag, Marilyn could also identify herself as an Ibanag. Sheila could do the same. Agustin could do the same. Frederick could do the same. In fact, anyone can identify if they are indigenous. But there is a second point to that. The community that you belong should ascribe you that identification. Okay? Meaning that my community up north in the Philippines, we are about 600,000. When I say I'm an Ibanag, my people should tell me, yes, this guy, this woman, this person belongs to us. Okay? Because otherwise, it's going to be very, very dangerous principle, self-identification. Now, some of the issues that we have here is that, is it enough self-identification as an entry point to discussing indigenous peoples? Now, one thing that you need to understand is that most indigenous peoples in the world, they've been subjected, and I like someone who mentioned here, historical injustices. When we talk about people who were subjected to all forms of violation, from genocide to massacre to ethnic cleansing, and it's happening up to today. We're talking about up to today. It's indigenous peoples, all right? So that when we talk about the subjective criteria of who are indigenous peoples, here are the following. Indigenous peoples are peoples who've been living in a certain territory or area even before colonization, and despite all the process of trying to eradicate them, they still want to maintain that identity. Okay, they still want to maintain that identity. Despite colonization, even in the formation of the new state, that they were not a part of that forming of new state. And so that when you identify indigenous people, these are people who've been living in a certain territory before the formation of the modern state. Now, that's one. So if you are coming from a community who's been living in a certain territory before United States as such was created, or Canada as such, then you might be an indigenous person. Now, the second part is that indigenous peoples are people whose most important relationship is their attachment to the land. Because as Wahid Abdul has mentioned, the land in itself is not a commodity. Okay, the land is a part of the indigenous identity, like myself, Ibanag. Our people is called Ibanag, but our territory is also called as such. Okay, like for example, the Mapuche in Chile. Ma, what does Ma means? People chase the land, people of the land. And these people had been living in that territory even before colonization. Now, I'll stop just to give you a bit of that flavor. But the other challenge the indigenous peoples are facing at the moment, despite having a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples now that provides or outlines the international standards, okay, on indigenous peoples like land rights. Sheila has mentioned about the principle of pre-prior informed consent. In fact, even the right to self-determination is a part of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Okay, so I'll stop there now, and I'm going to show you a bit of, I have a PowerPoint, but maybe before I will do that, just to also flag that when we talk about indigenous peoples, it's not, it's a very diverse community, okay? Do you know how many languages do we have in the world? Can you guess? Can you put that in the chat? According to UNESCO. Anyone? They said that we have about 3,000? No, 230 more. 10,000, that's a bit too much. This is about 7,000 languages in the world. You know how many of these 7,000 languages are actually indigenous languages? It's about 5,000. Now, take note. What does it mean for you and for all of us here? It means that when we actually talk about the world diversity, okay, whether this is culturally, linguistically, we are actually looking at indigenous peoples. Okay, we are looking at indigenous peoples. Now, you have to take note that language is not just the spoken language that we are talking about, that we are listening. When you talk about indigenous languages, we're talking about traditional knowledge of what? Of the environment, of the cosmovision, of the history, of a whole country, an identity of a whole civilization, okay? And knowledge of the sea, knowledge of the mountain. So that one thing that you need to also be very cautious now is that UNESCO, according to its report, that every week, one indigenous language is dying. And I can tell you, when that language is dead, that's the end of a whole civilization. That's the end of a whole civilization. That's the end of a whole traditional knowledge. Okay? Right. Now, I'm going to connect a bit my presentation with the work that I do with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I am currently serving as the Secretary of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People, and I'm also coordinating the Indigenous Fellowship Program. These are two important opportunities for young people like you who belong to the indigenous communities. It could be very useful for you. So the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People, this is a financial grant that we provide to indigenous people so that they can participate in the most important processes and meeting at the UN international community that concerns them. Okay, so any member of an indigenous community can apply for this grant. Okay, you can apply two ways: as a representative of your community directly, or as a representative of your indigenous organization. How does it work? If you are selected as a grantee of the fund, then you are provided with a round trip ticket to the meeting venue. We provide you with a daily subsistence allowance that covers your food and accommodation, including your local transport, and we also facilitate your visa application. I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot of what UN meetings and processes that the fund is mandated to support. First, it's the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I'm moving here. What is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues? This is a body that meets annually in New York. It's a subsidiary body of the UN ECOSOC, which is one of the principal organs of the UN. And its main mandate is to provide advice and recommendation to the ECOSOC. Okay? It's mandated to raise awareness and promote coordination of activities among UN agencies, funds, and programs. And most importantly, it's to prepare and disseminate information about indigenous issues and to ensure that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is implemented. The last session of the Permanent Forum was held in April, May this year. And if you're interested to learn more about the work of the Permanent Forum, you can check the web page here. Now, for indigenous people, this is one of the highest forums where indigenous peoples participate. It's one of the highest and one of the only few UN processes where indigenous peoples themselves are actually the one discussing vis-a-vis their own government on issues related to their economic, social, cultural, environmental, education, health, and human rights issues. Okay? And this is the biggest forum of indigenous peoples on an annual basis. We have about 3,000 indigenous peoples descending to New York on an annual basis. And you can apply for travel grant with the UN Voluntary Fund. Next, it's the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. Now, if you have the Permanent Forum in New York, which is under the ECOSOC, in Geneva, under the Human Rights Council, you have the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people. They meet in July for 1 week. Now, the difference between the two, you have to take note. This is a body under the Human Rights Council. So any human rights issues that relates to indigenous peoples, and if you wanted to specialize on indigenous issues, you come to the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. The meeting is 5 days. You can apply for the fund to participate in this important mechanism. The Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council meets 3 times a year, one in March, the other one in June, but the most important for indigenous people is the one in September. Why in September? Because this is the session where the expert mechanism, so if you miss the session of the expert mechanism in July, you can still follow the discussion at the Human Rights Council because expert mechanism reports to the Human Rights Council. If you have heard about the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous People, this is also the time when the Special Rapporteur reports to the Council. I don't know if you have heard about the UPR. This is the Universal Periodic Review. This is also a subsidiary body, the Human Rights Council. This is one of the most important mechanisms inside the UN. This is the mechanism that reviews the human rights record of every single country in the world, whether you're coming from a developed or developing country. It's universal because all countries in the world have to go to a review of the human rights record. It's periodic because it's every 4.5 years. It's a review because it's a peer review. Where can Indigenous peoples participate? Indigenous peoples can participate in the whole process of the review. I'm not going into the details, but if you're interested, let me know, because this is one of the most important process that we have in the UN system. The UN treaty bodies, it's gonna be a bit technical now. The UN treaty bodies, these are, I would say, the hardcore human rights bodies in the UN. Why hardcore? Because these are based on human rights treaties. Some of you probably have heard about the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, those of you are interested on women's rights. Maybe some of you have worked on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, or the human rights of migrant workers, or Convention Against Torture. This convention, they have a body that monitors the implementation of this convention. They're called the treaty bodies. Now, the difference between this body and the rest of the first mechanism I mentioned is that you can only participate in these bodies if your country is a signatory to those international treaties, or they have ratified these international treaties. And if your country have ratified, they're supposed to come back to Geneva and present a report every 2 to 3 years on how they are implementing these international treaties. You can apply for the fund to participate in these bodies. Now, some of you have mentioned that you are interested to look at the intersection of human rights, business, and transnational companies. On an annual basis, one of the most, in fact, this is now the biggest human rights meeting in Geneva. It's the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. It takes place in Geneva in November over 3 days. And Indigenous peoples, it is not by accident that when it comes to the most important activities when it comes to development, like extractive industries, mining, and I think Sheila has mentioned many of these issues, you will be surprised. Transnational companies are now also speaking a human rights language, and they're very good at it. We need to ensure that if you're working on human rights, that you need to be in this forum. Because I can tell you, no government, no transnational companies would actually accept that they are violating human rights. And to be in this forum as a witness, you know, as someone who can tell the story of what's happening in your community, again, you can apply for the fund to support you in this forum. We are almost there. Now, climate change, which is the topic of many of you are probably very engaged. Of course, climate change is one of the most important topics when we talk about Indigenous people. And as you may know, you probably have heard, you know, they contribute the least, but they suffered the most on climate change. And Indigenous traditional knowledge has been considered and recognized by the international community as one of the best forms of science. But still, you have to understand that in many countries in the world, discrimination is such a very structural issue that they wouldn't even consider their presence even at climate negotiation. It's very sad. I've been into at least 4 COP meetings, and most Indigenous people, even if we are able to manage to bring them in those sessions, first, those sessions are very Anglophone, mainly in English. One of the most incredible scenario I have seen is that there was one room when they're talking about the impact of climate change in the Amazon. And we brought more than 20 Indigenous people from the Amazon, but they cannot participate. Why? Because the session is mainly in English. And that room is talking about people who are outside of the room. You see the challenge that we're talking about. So again, you can apply for the fund to participate in COP or climate change processes. Within the COP, there is one structure that is very specific to Indigenous people, and it's the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, okay? They meet 1 week before Substa, if it's taking place in June, or they meet 1 week before COP during the COP meeting. The last information I would like to share to you is the Indigenous Fellowship Program. This is one of the most comprehensive human rights training program that we have in the office. It's been running for almost 30 years now. This is a training program for a month, and it's available in 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Russian, and Portuguese. So if you speak any of those languages, you can apply for this fellowship program. We bring you to Geneva and we expose you to all the mechanism that I've just mentioned earlier on. It's normally 1 week, but each linguistic group, they also have their own preparatory training. For example, the Spanish speaking, they have a 2 months preparatory in Spain. The Portuguese, they go to Brasilia with our partner university for 2 weeks. The Russian, we have a partner in Russia. And then the French-speaking Indigenous fellows, they go either in Canada, in Quebec, or in Yaoundé, Cameroon for the preparatory training. I'll stop here. And if you have any question, I'll be most happy to discuss or share a bit more. Over to you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Morse, for that really insightful presentation. And it's you're walking through what all the different elements that are complementary to climate change. And sometimes we want to advocate for all these problematics that are taking place, and we focus merely on climate when there's all these other spaces where we can raise our voices. And as you hear from Morse, there's a lot of funding opportunities if you feel that is where you need to go. And it's always important because sometimes we as younger generations, we want to go to COP because it's the most trendy one somehow, but we forget about the rest, right? And that's really important that you're raising here. So thank you so much, Morse. And yes, indeed, we have some questions. I think one that if we can highlight Sheila and Abdul, if you guys are still there. One of the questions that I'm going to make to all of you is if you have any book recommendation that you can mention to the audience, because they would love to learn more. So maybe the 3 of you can answer these questions because it's universal. I also interested, what will you suggest? Maybe we go with...
From my side, very quickly, if you really want to know the pulse of what's happening with the Indigenous world, I will put the link. If GIA is the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs, they have an annual report on the situation of Indigenous people around the world. I will put the link in our chat.
Thank you so much. Maybe Sheila, any idea, any book?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of piggyback off of using poetic resistance and recommend Post-Colonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz.
What about?
This is a difficult question. There are so many, but I think I'll go with probably Breading Sweetgrass. It's by Robin Wall. I think, it kind of relates to my work, and if anybody is new to this space, this would be a good book.
Great. Amazing. Now we have one question for Sheila, one question for Abdul from the previous presentations. Sheila, it says, I recently discovered the small-scale mining being practiced in some countries traditionally. Do you think it might be a more sustainable alternative? I think it's mentioning that the mining is also practiced by some communities in a traditional manner. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that question. So I think whether or not it could be sustainable is a matter of both scale and intent. So when we're practicing traditional mining, it's not to supply the entire US Army fleet with lithium for electric vehicles, which is one of the things that is actually being done. And the US is planning on having a completely electric military fleet by 2035. I can't believe that that's part of their sustainability plan, but whatever. So if it's being done on a smaller scale, then sure. And then the other thing is for intent. Is the mining being done for intent to get some minerals for basic necessities or adornment? or is it being done for profit? Because the moment anything is being done for external profit, it is, susceptible for corruption. So I think those are the things that are going to kind of need to be asked, because even when we're practicing things traditionally, if we allow kind of these settler values to seep into our traditional practices, those can be corrupted as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheila. And the question for Abdul is, what advice would you give to address the problem of free riders when managing the commons? I have encountered this problem in movements also with respect to non-material commons, ideas, reflections, cultural exchanges, etc.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I've tried to answer that on the chat as well. But I mean, it's a bit different in my area. I've studied with indigenous population mostly. It's a very respectful ownership and participation in commons. So that might be a bit different, but with non-material commons, it can be a problem. But usually, like the way I see it is a lot of commons are assumed to be that way. If you have read Hardin, for instance, who first talked about the tragedy of the commons, which basically says, there would be people who would exploit the resources and so on, which, in many communities, indigenous communities especially, but also local communities, is not true. People care for each other, people care for the resource and so on. So I think, having that mindset and having challenged the free rider concept is also essential when we talk about commons. But for knowledges and
Bado kidogo.
stuff, like I suggested, I think, it would always be a good way to approach this is to be generous with the knowledge that you share, to always kind of, preach the good practices of generosity, which can bring in people to participate in these commons as well.
Thank you so much, Abdul. Agreed 100%. And I invite you all guys all the time to do some Instagram stories, not because we love the social media, but it's the way to democratize the knowledge. And last question for Morse, and with this, I think we can finish. It's a question that I would love for you guys to explain is, what's the difference in between local people and indigenous communities? Because it's something that actually raised during COP29, and Sheila was there. We were hosting one of the meetings of the avocado framework, and then these questions, this topic arise, and I was also like mind-blowing with this difference. If you can enlighten us a bit more, so it will be great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I think it's good that you're raising this question because it's becoming a very politicized issue. And, for young people, I think it's also important for you to understand, where is this issue coming from? The first question or the first issue that you need to demystify is when we talk about indigenous peoples in comparison to other groups or peoples, that these are people who are already, I would say, not governed, but there is international standards that sets out who they are. That there is already, that we call them, these are people that have they're called right holders, not stakeholders, because now you have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who actually set the standards of who they are. And when we talk about indigenous peoples, there is already a whole architecture of who they are. And in the UN system, it's quite clear when we talk about indigenous peoples as opposed to local communities or people of African descent or minorities in general. Okay. So when we look at indigenous peoples, you should be looking and reading about the UN Declaration and the Rights of Indigenous People. You should be looking at the ILO Convention 169 when we talk about who are these people, okay? And I have already provided you some of those elements that, that identify who they are. Now, you need to take note when you talk about indigenous people, it's not the job of your government to define who you are. It is not the job of the UN either to identify who are indigenous people. It is you as a peoples, okay, to identify who you are. Because if you let your government define who you are, I can tell you they can do whatever they want in their own convenience. Okay? But again, we need to be very clear. We have an international standards that tells us who are indigenous peoples already. So if you know who they are, give them that space, that voice, that recognition as such. Because I can tell you, they fought so hard to have that space. It took them 100 years to even tell that they are indigenous people. Okay? Local communities. Now, this is the tricky part, because in the international community, there is no legal standing of who are local communities. Okay? There is no international standard who says who are local communities. What happened? Where this concept is coming from? It comes from countries who doesn't want to recognize their own indigenous peoples. Why they don't want to recognize? Because indigenous people's rights have given indigenous people the right to land. And that is the most contentious issue. And it's not by accident that indigenous peoples are living in the most important strategic territories in the world. Okay? So, in as much as we would like to use this term, and this, if you are an indigenous people, I would highly encourage you, or for everybody, that when you talk about indigenous peoples, don't confuse them with other groups. And that is why this conflation of indigenous peoples and local communities, there is even a movement. You see, the UN in itself had a mistake. This is my personal opinion, don't take it, because they put this structure, local communities, indigenous peoples platform. You see, that structure is already in UNCCC. There is no going back to do that because it's an international treaty that created that mechanism. But don't conflate the two. Indigenous peoples, there is already an international standards. So then the question is, who are local communities? Now my question is, well, if you are a local community and there is no definition of who are local communities, then come forward and tell to the world who you are. Self-identify yourself. That's how indigenous people started this process. Okay? That's how I'm going to, to put forward that issue. Now, just want to just very, very small correction. When you talk about indigenous peoples, use the term peoples with an S. Not a people, not a population, not a community. Peoples. You know why? Because peoples has an international legal standing under international law. People doesn't have, community doesn't have, okay? And the most important when you talk about indigenous peoples, and it's mentioned, capitalized, very correct. Peoples, it's the one with an S that recognizes the right to self-determination. What does it mean? That you, when you are a people, you can freely determine your political status, including your economic, social, and cultural rights. Mm-hmm. And peoples, it's not by accident that even in the UN Charter says, we, not the government, not the state, it says we the peoples. Those are the first two words in the UN Charter. In fact, almost all our countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they use the term peoples to become independent. Now, take note, as I have mentioned to you, indigenous peoples were there before these states were created. That is why if you are in Canada, they're called First Nations, yeah, Aboriginal communities, because that's the situation, that's the context of those concepts. So use them because those concepts were there to be respected.
Thank you so much, Morse, for that great and deep answer. Sorry, Frederick, for taking over. Just that, thank you so much for the interpreters, for eco interpreters. They will have to leave now. And Frederick, please, can you help us now?
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for every interpreter who making possible for this training, for making sure people understand from their language. This is how we call it local languages. Maybe sometimes Spanish could be a local language. Anyway, we have a reminder. The recording are always sent out after the session. You can also find them on this Smith School YouTube channel and at Oxford Smith School. We will also send the link via email. A different language will be available soon after this. Also on the Smith School YouTube channel. Slides are available on the in the 4 participant Google Drive folder. This is sent out in the reminder email and it will be planned on the Slack. You will also receive the attendance form in the follow-up email to the station. So I think you get it covered. And after here, we are going to the optional breakout rooms. There you'll be able to quick chat and share some of the experience. And if you think you need to learn to connect and everything, it's a very good time for that. And you maybe allocate yourself to the language that you speak. I think will be some of the interpreters have been left, and I think that's you'll be have interchanging of the experience. So maybe Fred, you could make it that happening.
There you go. Now you can join the breakout rooms. The button is there. Thank you so much, Frederick and Fred. And please feel free to join any of the breakout rooms and go to the language. I encourage you guys, there's multiple English channels. So instead of everyone going to just one where you listen to 2, 3 of you, I suggest you to go to the different English channels that you have so you can have proper conversations, because you have the amazing and unique opportunity to talk with people alike from all over the planet. And that's the Global Youth Climate Training for, because we want you to talk and share ideas. So join the different breakout rooms, and also maybe, I don't know, Morse, if you're gonna join one of them, will be great.
Absolutely. How do I go?
Yeah, under where you have the mic and that panel, to the right,
Yes.
you have one that says join breakout room.
Join. Yes, indeed. I got it. All right.
Great,
I'll do
perfect.
it now.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to all the eco interpreters for your amazing support and making it possible that we are speaking all the possible languages that you have with us. So join the breakout rooms and
Rejoignez